Pregnant, desperate, and still begging for a man who chose someone better.
I'm not begging. I'm ending this marriage.
What have you done?
Hook dialogue. You asked me once how I knew I could trust you. I want you to think about your answer while you look at what I am holding. Pre-story, summary. The last Sunday her father called, he asked about her work, not the marriage. The work she had before she became someone's wife. She told him she had some consulting going. He said that was not what he meant. That was the last real conversation they had before he was gone. 6 weeks later, Nora found the reason he had been asking in a leather case he left behind, with his initials near the base and 31% of her husband's company inside it. He had known what was coming. He had been making sure she would be ready. 4 months after that, 7 months pregnant, sitting at the back corner table of the restaurant where her husband had proposed to her, watching that same husband share a candlelit dinner with another woman 20 feet away she was. Chapter 1. She knew. Before she walked through the door, the ring was the thing she had not expected. She had expected everything else. She had expected to see them at that table together, her husband and the woman he had been spending his evenings with for 2.5 years. She had expected the easy way they would sit together, the specific body language of two people who have moved past performing comfort and have simply arrived at it. She had expected the weight of it to land differently in person than in the photographs, and it did, but not in the way she had imagined. What she had not expected was the ring. It was on Serena Voss's right hand, catching the candlelight from 20 feet away, and Nora Calloway recognized it the way you recognize something that used to live in your own home. Platinum band, no stone, a slight texture around the edge. She had watched that ring catch light at dinner parties and board functions and quiet evenings on the couch for 4 years of marriage. She knew it the way she knew the sound of the elevator when Reed came home, the specific kind of knowing that belongs to the things you live alongside every day without registering until they are gone. He had told her it was lost in the move. 2 years ago, standing at the kitchen counter of the house they had just moved into, he had mentioned it casually. Probably in one of the boxes, he said. She had offered to trace the movers. He said it was not worth the trouble. She had let it go because she had gotten very practiced at letting things go. The ring was not lost. The ring had been given, not carelessly or sentimentally, but in the easy way of a man distributing pieces of his life between compartments he had never once worried would intersect. He had stood at her kitchen counter and let her offer to make calls. And the ring had already been somewhere else, and it had not occurred to him to feel anything about that because it had never occurred to him that it should. She picked up her water glass. She held it. She let what the ring meant settle completely into place. Then she set the glass down and returned her attention to the evening, which had a specific shape she had spent 4 months building and intended to complete exactly as designed. She had arrived at Marchetti's at 7:45 that Thursday evening, in October, 15 minutes before Reed was expected, which was the margin she had decided on weeks ago and had not adjusted since. She had asked the hostess for the corner table at the back, near the wine rack, where you could see the whole room without being at its center. She had set her coat over the back of the chair, placed her father's leather portfolio case on the seat beside her, and ordered still water and sparkling with no ice. Marchetti's communicated wealth the way old money prefers it communicated, which is to say indirectly. White tablecloths with real weight, crystal candle holders. The acoustics of a room where 30 conversations could happen at once and each one feel private. She had moved through this room enough times that it no longer impressed her, though that had not always been the case. Reed had brought her here on their second date when she was 26, and the kind of person who looked up menus the night before so she would not seem uncertain when they ordered. He had proposed at the corner table near the window on a Tuesday evening in March, the one with the small brass lamp that made the light warm and close, and she had said yes before he finished asking. She remembered the certainty she had felt in her chest when she said the word. She had believed completely in that moment. She had not chosen tonight's location without thinking about that. Before she married Reed, Nora Ashby had been an architect, not decoratively, not in the way the word sometimes gets received at parties before people nod and move on. She had a master's degree from Columbia. She had won a regional design award at 26 for a community arts building in the Bronx that a critic described as elegant without being precious, which was the phrase she had valued most. She had been 4 years at a firm that turned down more work than it accepted, on the partner track, caring specifically and precisely about things like how light moved through a north-facing window at 4 in the afternoon, about the difference between a space that accommodated people and a space that understood them. She had let that version of herself recede by degrees, so gradual she had barely noticed any single one. The consulting she did from home was real but smaller. The life she managed for 2 people was substantial, but nobody called it architecture. And somewhere in the distance between the woman who had drawn those plans and argued for those sight lines and the woman sitting at this corner table on a Thursday in October, 7 months pregnant with her father's briefcase beside her, something had contracted. Over the previous 4 months she had been finding it again. She was nearly back. The portfolio case had been Martin Ashby's for 30 years. The leather at the handles had softened from daily use, and the brass fittings at the corners had gone from bright to pewter. Near the base, his initials were pressed into the leather in what had once been gold paint, M.A. The paint had faded enough that you needed to know to look for them. She always knew. She had found the case in his home office 3 weeks after the funeral, under a shelf of journals he had meant to sort. She had taken it home without knowing exactly why, and it had not left her side in 4 months. The reason was inside it. At 8 o'clock, the door opened and Serena Voss walked in. Nora had studied the investigator's photographs since June, so the face was familiar before anything else registered. Dark hair worn up in the way that takes 20 minutes to look effortless. A deep green wrap dress chosen precisely for this light, the movement of a woman who has never been in a room that did not arrange itself around her. She watched Serena speak to the maitre d'. She watched her make a small adjustment to the seating arrangement. Then Serena turned to a server nearby and said, without lowering her voice in any meaningful way, "I need this section kept quiet for the evening. We have documents to go through before the other guests arrive, and I would appreciate not having anyone hovering over the table." The server nodded and said, "Of course." Nora noted this without expression. Not cruelty, nothing you could name precisely and call out. Just a woman managing a room with the ease of someone who has never been in a space that required her to ask nicely. She had seen that quality before, in a slightly different form, in the man Serena was waiting for. Serena sat down facing the entrance, which meant she was facing in Nora's direction. Nora sat completely still and waited to see if she registered her. She did not. A woman alone at a back table, 7 months pregnant, with a briefcase on the chair beside her, was not the kind of detail Serena was looking for in a room. This was not surprising. It was the same quality of oversight that had made the past 4 months possible. At 8:17, Reed came through the door. She had not seen him in 11 days. He was tall, in the dark overcoat she recognized, carrying himself with the ease of a man who has never walked into a room that was not ready for him. He did not look around when he entered. He walked toward the table as if the room had been arranged for his arrival. because in most cases it had been. He reached Serena and kissed her in a way that left nothing ambiguous, not a greeting. The contact of two people who have built a significant amount of private time together and are not in this moment taking any particular care to be discreet. He sat down across from her and said something that made her laugh in the real way. The unguarded kind, the kind people only give to people they have stopped performing in front of. Nora looked at the ring, catching the light one more time. Then she looked at the portfolio case on the chair beside her. Her phone buzzed once on the table. Diana Park. Everything is ready. Decision is yours. She read it twice, set the phone face down. She opened the portfolio case and touched the documents without removing them. The divorce petition, filed that morning. The proxy voting statement. The SEC notification filed at 5 o'clock. She had read every word of every page until she could recite them. She closed the case. In approximately 20 minutes, the merger partners were scheduled to arrive at that table. Signatures would happen, the transaction would close, and by morning, the 31% trust her father had spent 11 years quietly preserving for her would be dissolved. That was not going to happen. She thought about her father, about the Sunday calls and the leather case beside her, and the sentence at the bottom of the letter she had found 4 months ago that she had read until it became part of how she moved through each day. She thought about the ring on Serena Voss's right hand, the ring that had lived in her own home, catching the candlelight in the restaurant where her husband had once asked her to trust him. She stood up. She picked up the portfolio case. She walked toward the table. Chapter 2, the night she cried and nobody saw it. To understand what Nora was carrying when she stood up from that table, you have to go back to June. Martin Ashby died on a Thursday in the second week of June. Heart attack, the doctors said, significant and fast. He had been at his desk in the home office of the house on the Upper West Side, the room where he had spent 30 years of Sunday mornings, with coffee and architectural journals, and the specific quality of sustained attention that had made him one of the finest minds Nora had ever known. He was 67. He had been 67 for 3 weeks. She got the call at 2:15 in the afternoon and sat down on the kitchen floor with her phone in her hand and did not move for a while. The 2 weeks after the funeral were the practical kind of grief, which has the particular mercy of keeping you too occupied to feel everything at once. The estate documents, the notifications, the legal appointments. Her mother had been gone for 8 years, and there were no siblings, which meant all of it fell to Nora, and she handled it the way she handled most things, precisely and without complaint, putting the feelings in a room inside herself and closing the door because there was too much to do to open it yet. She got to the portfolio case 3 weeks after the funeral. She had been on the floor of his home office working through files when she found it at the bottom of a stack under 3 years of architectural journals he had never gotten around to organizing. She recognized it immediately. She had watched him carry it her whole life. She opened it expecting old project files, documents from the early years. Instead, she found an envelope, not sealed, her name in his handwriting on the front. She sat down on the floor right there and opened it. The letter was 1 page, front and back, in the dense, slanted script she had known her whole life, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in the early 70s and had never fully trusted keyboards. He had started writing it the previous March, he said, when he began to feel something was not quite right in a way he could not name but had learned at 67 to take seriously. He was not being dramatic. He simply believed in addressing things before they required addressing. He explained the trust. He and Thomas Callaway had founded what became Callaway Capital together in 1987 two men in their 30s in a two-room midtown office who believed they could build something. They did, and when Thomas died in 2013 and the Calloway family moved to take full control, Martin had accepted a structured settlement and stepped back. He had done it with his eyes open and without bitterness, because he was not a man who let bitterness govern his decisions. But embedded in the original partnership agreement was something that had never been dissolved: a 31% equity trust in his daughter's name, vesting on her 35th birthday. He had not told her while he was alive because he had not wanted her to carry the knowledge before she needed it. He hoped she would never need it. If she was reading this, she might. Then he turned the page over and wrote about something other than the trust. He wrote that he had watched her marriage for 4 years from the outside and had seen things he had not felt it was his place to name, because she was a grown woman and he believed in her ability to arrive at her own conclusions in her own time. But he could say this: she had been, for as long as he had known her, one of the clearest thinking people he had ever encountered in a lifetime full of them. He had watched her become quieter over the years in a way that was not peace. He had watched her edit herself in rooms where she should not have needed to. He had not said anything, but he had made sure she had something of her own, in case she ever decided she needed it. The letter ended with one sentence that had nothing to do with the trust or the marriage. He wrote, "I want you to know that I saw you. I always saw you." Nora sat on the floor of her father's study for a long time. She cried in the way of a person who has been holding something very tightly for very long and has had the grip suddenly released, not gracefully, completely. She cried for her father, for the Sunday calls that would not come anymore, for the specific quality of attention he had given her that she had not fully understood the rarity of until it was gone. And she cried for something she could not name exactly, something that had to do with being seen, and with having spent 4 years in a marriage where being seen had not been one of the available arrangements, and with understanding in that room at 35 that the person who had seen her most clearly was gone. She cried until she did not have anything left for that night. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, ran cold water over her face, came back to the desk, and read the letter again. She had her legal pad out by midnight. She called Diana Park at 9 the following morning. Diana had been her attorney for 6 years and had the quality of sounding entirely unbothered by whatever information was placed in front of her, which Nora had always valued and now found essential. She told Diana everything in 20 minutes: the trust, what she suspected about the merger. She was clear and specific and did not use words like betrayed or furious, because those words were true but not useful at 9 in the morning with a legal pad in front of her. Diana listened and said she would recommend a forensic accountant, and asked if Nora was certain she wanted to proceed. Nora said, "I am certain. Please make the call." Gerald Choi had testified in 3 separate SEC investigations and had the patience of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for and is willing to take whatever time is required to find it. He spent 6 weeks on the Calloway capital structure before he found it, buried in a subordinate exhibit of the merger proposal, in language engineered to be read past by anyone who did not know what to look for, was a provision dissolving all legacy partnership instruments upon completion of the transaction. 7 words designed to eliminate her stake before she thought to look for it. Diana called on a Tuesday afternoon in August with Gerald's findings. After the call, Nora sat at the kitchen table without moving and looked at the portfolio case on the chair beside her, at the worn leather and the faded initials near the base, and she thought about her father sitting at a desk on the Upper West Side the previous March, writing a letter for his daughter to find after he was gone, making sure she would not be standing empty-handed when the day came. She pressed her hand flat against the leather of the case, the softness of 30 years of daily use. She said out loud, in an empty kitchen, "I see it, Dad. I see it." Then she picked up the phone and called Diana back, and the second phase of the work began. The private investigator Diana recommended confirmed the rest of the picture. The affair had begun 2 years and 7 months ago. The first documented contact between Reed and Serena was a dinner in Chicago in January of the year before last, which the investigator reconstructed from phone records and the systematic patience he was paid to bring. He gave Nora the full timeline, the hotels, the pattern of meetings, the evidence of something that had been running for a substantial period of time. But there was something else in his report, something that reordered the entire picture. Serena Voss had accessed the original Callaway Capital Partnership documents through due diligence filings in November of the year before last, 2 months before the Chicago dinner. She had found the dormant trust in those documents. She had then designed the merger structure specifically to dissolve it, and she had then, with that structure in her files and that plan already formed, initiated contact with Reed Callaway at a conference dinner in Chicago 2 months later. She had not stumbled into a useful relationship. She had engineered one. She had looked at the structure of Reed's company, found the liability, found the wife everyone around him treated as decorative, and decided that the wife was not a factor worth calculating. Nora had sat with that information for 3 days before she stopped being surprised by it. Then she had called Diana and continued the work. She kept being the version of herself that the world expected. She attended the events. She managed the household. She had the conversations and said the right things and presented the surface that a woman 7 months pregnant who has recently lost her father is expected to present. And she did it well enough that no one had reason to look more carefully. Reed had not looked more carefully. He had been attentive in the specific way he became attentive when guilt was operating beneath the surface, and she had received the attentiveness graciously and meant none of it, and none of it had reached her. What had reached her was the work. Now she sat at the back corner table of Marchetti's and watched Serena Voss open the burgundy document folder she had brought for the evening, and she understood exactly what she was looking at. Not a romantic dinner. A woman running an operation she had been building for 2.5 years, in the final hour before it was supposed to close. A woman who had looked at Nora Callaway once and decided she was not worth looking at again. Nora touched the portfolio case. She looked at the ring one more time, platinum and steady in the candlelight. Then she was done looking. Chapter 3. The last moment she could have turned back. By 8:25, the burgundy folder was open on the table. Nora had been watching for it. Serena had set it at the table's edge when she arrived, the placement of someone who knows its contents and does not need to obscure them. For the past 40 minutes, it had sat there while Reed and Serena moved through the easy rhythm of two people who have stopped needing to impress each other. Now Serena had opened it. She slid a set of documents across to Reed. He took them in the way he took most things handed to him, without looking up first, without asking what they were. He set them beside his plate and glanced down occasionally with the distracted focus of someone reviewing something he has already decided about. Nora checked the time. 8:26. The partners were expected between 8:45 and 9. That gave her at most 19 minutes before the table had enough people and enough momentum that the signing became a matter of inevitability rather than choice. She stood and walked toward the restrooms. The hallway past the bar was quiet in the way back sections of good restaurants are quiet, removed from the room's main current. She moved through it without hurrying. Hurrying was its own kind of announcement, and she had not come this far to make the wrong ones. The restroom was white marble, warm-lit, with small candles arranged on the counter, empty. She set the portfolio case down, ran cold water over her wrists the way she had since she was a teenager when she needed to slow herself down, and looked at her face in the mirror. She looked like exactly what she was. 7 months pregnant, not having slept enough in 4 months, about to do something that could not be undone. There were things around her eyes that had not been there 4 years ago. Not lines exactly, but a quality. The particular look of sustained effort that settles into a face whether you invite it or not. She was wearing a dark blue dress she had chosen specifically for tonight, something that read as composed without reading as formal. Composed was what she was. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Read," she answered, because not answering would have been its own announcement. "Hey." His voice came through warm and slightly distracted, the register of a man calling between things. "Wanted to check in. How are you feeling?" She was standing 20 steps from the dining room. She was holding their daughter in her body. She was holding the evening's documentation in a leather case on the marble counter beside her, and she was listening to her husband ask how she was feeling. "I am all right," she said. Her voice came out the way she had trained it over 4 years of similar conversations. Easy, unhurried, nothing given away. "You should rest," he said. "It is going to be a late night on this end. The partners on the Voss deal, there is a Hong Kong investor on the call, and the time difference is working against us. Could be a few hours. Do not wait up." She looked at her face in the mirror. He was at a table she could walk to, and in 30 seconds, he was sitting across from the woman who had been wearing his ring for 2 years. He was calling his pregnant wife to say he was working late, with the warmth of a man who had practiced caring in a register that required him to feel almost nothing while performing almost everything. She had heard that warmth so many times. "Okay," she said. "Do not work too late." "I will try," he said. "Take care of yourself and her." They had been calling the baby her since the 2nd month, not because they had confirmed it, but because it was what they both felt. And speaking to the idea of a daughter as if she were already in the room had been one of the few genuinely shared things between them in the previous 2 years. "I will," she said. He ended the call. She set the phone on the counter next to the portfolio case and stood very still. The screen went dark. She turned the cold water on again and held her wrists under it and breathed slowly, the way she had learned to breathe through the previous 4 months when steadiness did not come on its own. Then Diana called. "I was about to call you," Nora said. "I know. I am sorry to do this now." Diana's voice was the same as always, measured, without performance. "Serena's legal team filed an amended transaction timeline this afternoon. I spoke to Gerald. The signing has been moved up. They are calling it a standard month-end adjustment." Nora was quiet. "It is not standard," Diana said. "The timing is specific. The SEC notification you filed today will not appear as an active inquiry until tomorrow morning. If the transaction is signed before midnight tonight, the dissolution clause becomes enforceable at the moment of completion. We move into litigation. It is a different fight than the one we have now." "How different?" "Longer, more expensive, less certain, not impossible, but the documents you hold give you leverage before the signing that they do not give you after. If you are going to act tonight, it needs to be before the partners arrive. How long do I have?" "Partners are scheduled for 8:45. It is 8:32. 13 minutes. "All right," Nora said. "Do you want to talk through it?" "No, I know what I am going to do." "I know you do," Diana said. "Call me when it is done." She set the phone in her coat pocket and looked at herself in the mirror for a long, even moment. She had thought about doing this quietly. She had thought about it for months. Diana had offered formal channels, injunctions, the courts at their own pace, the legal process working in the background, while Nora maintained her surface life and waited. She had considered it carefully and had known it was not what she was going to do. Her father had been gracious for 10 years, while a company he helped build was managed by people who acknowledged him only when necessary. He had accepted the settlement and attended the dinners and never made a scene. He had been quiet about the cost, and he had carried it, and he had died without ever being publicly credited for the thing his partnership had helped create. She was not going to handle this quietly. She thought about what he had said when she was 12, driving home from a school meeting where a teacher had been dismissive in the specific way that is nearly impossible to name but impossible to miss. He had pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off before he said it. The people who are not looking for you are always the most surprised when you are there. She had filed it away then, not knowing yet what it was for. Now she knew. She straightened. She picked up the portfolio case. She pushed open the door and came out into the hallway, and the sounds of the restaurant came back around her. The murmur and the glassware and the low music and the warmth of a room full of people having evenings that were going exactly the way evenings are supposed to go. She turned toward the dining room. She walked. Chapter 4, everything she knew, laid on one table. She had imagined this moment so many times over 4 months that imagining it had become a form of preparation, the way an architect walks a building in her mind before the first physical step is taken, working through every angle, accounting for every load. What she had not been able to fully account for was the lamp, the small brass lamp at the corner table near the window, making the light exactly the way it had been 9 years ago on a Tuesday evening in March, when Reed Calloway had asked her a question and she had answered it before he finished asking, because she was certain and because certainty had felt like the most uncomplicated thing she had ever known. The lamp did not care what was about to happen under it. It was just a lamp, making the light warm and close in the same way it always did for whoever happened to be sitting there. She stood at the edge of the table and felt the full weight of that for exactly 2 seconds. Then she set the portfolio case on the corner of the table and opened it. Reed had been mid-sentence when she arrived. She heard the tail end of something about Q4 structure, and then the sentence simply stopped. Not trailing off, not finding an ending. Just stopping the way a sentence stops when the thing it was about ceases to be the relevant thing. His face moved through recognition and then a very specific stillness. Not guilt alone, though that was present. Something more foundational. The expression of a man who has been handed information that does not fit any available category and is working to locate one. Nora. His voice had the quality it used when managing a room. Warm, controlled, calibrated to communicate that whoever was speaking was still in charge. "What are you doing here?" She did not answer him directly. She removed the first document from the portfolio case and set it on the table in front of him. The divorce petition. 3 pages, filed with the court at 9:47 that morning, bearing her signature and the firm name of Ashby, Park and Associates at the top. She watched him look at it. She watched his eyes find the letterhead and move to the first line and stop. She looked at Serena. Serena had gone still in the way of a person who has registered a threat and is measuring it. Not surprised. Calculating. Her wine glass had been set down in the moment the conversation stopped, and she was watching Nora with the focused attention of someone doing a rapid and serious assessment. Let her look. "I want to explain what is happening," Nora said, and her voice was exactly as she had trained it. Level. Specific. The voice of someone reporting findings. I want to be clear so that everyone at this table understands completely. This is not the place. Reed had turned the divorce petition face down, still managing the room, still in the mode of a man who believes that controlling the information means controlling the situation. Whatever needs to be said can be said at home. This is a professional engagement and I need you to. I know what this is, Nora said. He stopped. She turned slightly to address the table as a whole and spoke in the even way of someone who has said a thing so many times in her mind that the saying of it out loud is simply the final step. My name is Nora Calloway. I am Reed Calloway's wife, and I am a shareholder of Calloway Capital. I am here because I have information that everyone at this table needs to have before any documents are signed tonight. Serena's posture shifted, the smallest possible adjustment, but Nora saw it. She removed the second document, the proxy voting statement, 4 pages, signed and notarized, bearing Gerald Choi's certification and her signature at the bottom of every page. She placed it on the table between Reed and the burgundy folder. This is a proxy voting statement, exercising a 31% stake in Calloway Capital against the merger currently proposed between Calloway Capital and Voss Financial Partners. The stake was established in the original Calloway-Ashby Partnership Agreement of 1987. It vested in my name on my 35th birthday in June of this year. It has been certified and it is legally effective as of today. Reed picked it up. She watched him read. She watched the reading do something to his face that went deeper than surface reaction. Something was being rearranged. Not just new information landing on top of what was already there, but the foundation itself shifting underneath everything he thought he knew. He looked up. Not anger, not the recalibration she had watched him perform in difficult conversations before. What was in his face was rawer than any of that. It was the expression of a man who has been looking at something for 4 years without seeing it, and who is seeing it now, in this light, with this document in his hands, and who cannot unsee it. She did not let herself stay with that. There was more to say. She removed the third document, the SEC notification, 2 pages, filed at 5 o'clock that afternoon, documenting the fraudulent structure of the merger agreement and the specific role of the person who designed the dissolution clause and the timeline in which that design had occurred relative to other events. She set it on the table. The Securities and Exchange Commission received this notification at 5 o'clock today. It documents the provision in Exhibit 14 of the merger agreement, its purpose, and when the decision to include it was made relative to other significant developments in this deal. She looked at Serena when she said the last part. Serena moved. Mrs. Calloway, the boardroom voice. Practiced, even calibrated for a room where composure is currency. I understand you have had an enormously difficult several months. Losing a parent while managing a pregnancy is genuinely hard, and I want to be compassionate about that. But you are making serious legal allegations about a properly structured transaction that has been reviewed by multiple qualified parties, in a setting that is neither appropriate nor. The ring, Nora said. The table went quiet inside itself, not the restaurant. The restaurant kept going, music and glassware and conversation at their own indifferent pace. But inside the circumference of this conversation, something went very still. The ring on your right hand, Nora said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Platinum band, no stone, slightly textured edge. My husband told me 2 years ago that it was lost in our move. I helped him look. I suggested tracing the movers. A pause, not for effect, because the next sentence deserved its own space. I would prefer you not speak to me about appropriate settings. Serena's right hand came off the table. A small, involuntary withdrawal, there and gone in under a second. She caught it, brought her hand back, but the people paying attention had seen it. Reed had set the proxy statement down. He was looking at his own hands flat on the white tablecloth, not at Nora, not at Serena, at his own hands, as if they were a document he was trying to read. Serena turned to Reed. Reed. The voice was still controlled, but something had shifted under it. The difference between confidence that is intact and confidence that is being performed because the real thing has already left the room. This is a complication, not a conclusion. We address the inquiry, adjust the timeline, resubmit. None of this has to end tonight. Reed looked at her. He looked at her for several seconds. Then he looked back at the proxy statement on the table, at Nora's signature at the bottom of every page, at the 31% of his own company that had been sitting in his wife's name for 11 years while he ran it without ever thinking to look. He did not say anything. He did not say a single word to Serena. Serena held his silence for a moment. Then she looked at it and understood what it was. She sat back. Not a tactical retreat, not a woman making a calculated choice to regroup. Her hands came off the table, and her shoulders dropped by the smallest possible degree, and she looked at the documents spread across the white tablecloth with an expression that was arriving on her face whether she intended it or not. The scaffolding of a woman who always knows her next move had stopped holding. What remained was plainer and more final, the look of a person who built a 2.5-year construction on a single miscalculation and is now sitting in the room where that miscalculation has been laid out in front of everyone who needed to see it. She had decided Nora Calloway was not worth seeing. She was sitting in the wreckage of that decision now. The door of the restaurant opened, and two men in dark suits came through, one carrying a briefcase, moving with the purposeful ease of people arriving for a meeting they had confirmed. They reached the table, and one of them said, with pleasant professional confidence, "Are we ready to get started?" The table they arrived at was not the table they had come for. The first man looked at the documents spread across the cloth. He looked at Nora standing at the head of it with the open portfolio case. He looked at Reed, who had not looked up. He looked at Serena, who was sitting with a quality of stillness that had stopped being professional and had become something else entirely. "What is happening here?" he said. "The transaction cannot proceed tonight," Nora said. She looked at him with the same level tone she had maintained throughout. "An SEC inquiry was filed at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Your attorneys will confirm within the next 15 minutes. The man with the briefcase took out his phone. Nora picked up the portfolio case. She had said what she came to say. She had placed what she came to place. The rest of it belonged to the room and to the people in it, and it did not require her to stay and watch it unfold. She looked at Reed one last time. He was still looking at the proxy statement, at her name, at her signature. She turned and walked, not quickly, not with the performance of a dramatic exit. She moved through the restaurant the same way she had moved into it, without hurrying, without announcing herself, with the steadiness of someone who has completed what they set out to do and is now simply leaving. The room opened up around her and let her through. She pushed through the front door. October air, cold and clean and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside. The specific, honest indifference of a city that does not pause for any particular thing. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed it. Her heartbeat was present and elevated, the physical record of the previous 25 minutes. She took a long breath, then another. Then she called Diana. "Are you outside?" Diana said, before the second ring. "Yes." "How did it go?" Nora looked up at the strip of sky that a midtown block allows, orange dark, the city's particular version of night. "It went," she said. "Are you all right?" She thought about it. She was not all right in the sense of being unaffected. She was not the same person she had been an hour ago. but she was standing. The cold air was moving around her. Her daughter was moving with the slow rolling motion she had been making for 3 weeks. "I will be," she said. "I know," Diana said. "Go home. Rest." Briefing document at 6. She put the phone away. She raised her hand for a cab. The city moved around her the way it always did. She got in. She went home. Chapter 5. What Martin Ashby knew about his daughter. The signing had not happened. Diana called at 9:14 the following morning with the account. The partners had departed by 9:30. Their attorneys arrived within the hour. The transaction was formally suspended by 10 o'clock. By morning, the SEC notification had been logged as an active inquiry, which meant the suspension was no longer a matter of anyone's discretion. The merger was over. Not paused, not restructured. Over. Nora read the briefing document at the kitchen table and let herself feel, briefly and completely, the specific quality of a wrong thing being accurately removed. Not triumph, something quieter, the feeling of a situation that has been structurally false for a long time being finally and correctly named. She went to bed at 7 and slept 4 hours without interruption, the best sleep she had had in 4 months. 5 days after Marchetti's, Reed called. She answered because she always answered for practical matters, and practical matters still existed between them. His voice had the specific flatness of a man who has stripped the performance away because the information itself is the whole message. "Serena contacted me directly yesterday," he said, "not through her attorney, directly. She wants me to call you on her behalf. She is saying the investigation is going to affect the company valuation enough to hurt your own stake, and that you should think about what you actually want out of this." He stopped. "I told her I would not make that call," he said. "I am calling you now to tell you what she asked and what she said, because I am not going to be the person who keeps information from you and lets you find out about it some other way. Not anymore. But I am not her messenger, and I am not going to be." The line was quiet. "I know that is not much," he said. "It is what it is," Nora said. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He asked about the pregnancy, a logistical question about hospital paperwork she had mentioned the previous week. She answered it. The call ended with the particular civility of two people navigating something difficult without pretending it was not difficult. She set the phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the late October garden. He had made his choice, not dramatically, not in any way that invited applause. Just a quiet refusal to be used again, made directly, reported honestly. It was not much, but it was real, and she was done mistaking performance for reality, and she knew the difference now. 8 days after Marchetti's, Serena's legal team made formal contact through Diana. Their proposal: Serena would withdraw from Callaway Capital entirely, would not cooperate with the SEC inquiry, and would provide no testimony and no documentation. In exchange, she asked that Nora withdraw the SEC notification on grounds of insufficient evidence. Diana read it to her completely and then was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was not offering a view. No, Nora said. Diana communicated that response. 2 weeks after Marchetti's, James Whitfield came to see her. He was 56, interim CFO of Callaway Capital, a man who had spent 17 years at the company and who had called Diana first, which Nora respected. She showed him to the kitchen table. He accepted tea. He was a large man with gray at the temples and the face of someone who has spent a long time looking at numbers. He did not make small talk. "I am not here to defend the merger," he said. "I read the Exhibit 14 provision. I understand what it was built to do. I am not asking you to look past that." "All right," she said. "I am here because 2,300 people work for Callaway Capital, and none of them designed a fraudulent merger." He set both hands flat on the table, not aggressively. The hands of someone organizing his thoughts, before speaking them. 3 of the company's largest client contracts have renewal clauses allowing exit upon active federal investigation. If those contracts go, 2 regional offices cannot hold at current staffing. There are people with retirement accounts in company stock who did not sign up for this. He was not performing distress. He was reporting facts, the same way she had reported facts across a dinner table 17 days ago, and she recognized it for what it was. "I am not asking you not to proceed," he said. "I am asking whether the manner and the pace are things you have any ability to influence. You are a 31% stakeholder in that company. Those 2,300 people work for you too. I thought you should know that." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "The investigation proceeds," she said. "The notification stands. What happened with that merger needs to be on the record, and I will not change that." He nodded once. "But the pace and the manner of how Callaway Capital cooperates with the inquiry are things I am willing to discuss. There is a difference between full cooperation and cooperation that is structured to minimize damage to people who bear no responsibility for any of this." He stood and extended his hand. She shook it. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the late rose in the garden, still making its case against November. She thought about her father, who had known the difference between letting go and holding on, and who had never confused the two, and who had made that difference look effortless for so long, that she had not understood it until she needed to practice it herself. She was getting there. 28 days after Marchetti's, Diana briefed her on the SEC procedural meeting. "You do not need to attend," Diana said. "I am going to attend," Nora said. They met at Diana's office on the 16th floor, in the conference room with the long table and the quiet of a space that has held many consequential conversations. Nora arrived first and set the portfolio case on the table beside her chair and waited. Serena came in with her attorney, a careful man named Garrett, who moved with the awareness of someone who understood that everything in this room was being noted. Serena looked composed. Gray suit, hair up. Whatever she was managing internally, the external surface was holding. She sat across the table without looking at Nora directly. The meeting ran its procedural course. Garrett outlined the parameters of Serena's cooperation. Diana responded with the scope of what the inquiry required and what the existing documentation already established. It was formal and moved at the pace these things moved. Then Gerald Choi, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, placed 3 pages in the center. Due diligence access logs from the original Callaway Capital Partnership filings. Time-stamped, showing the specific date, the credentialed user, and the documents accessed. He explained what the logs showed: the date of access, the user credential, the fact that the Exhibit 14 dissolution clause had appeared in its current form in the merger draft 11 days after that access event. He said, "I want to make sure we are all working from the same factual foundation." The room was quiet. Garrett said something about the scope of what was properly in play at this stage of proceedings. Diana said the logs were properly in play. A pause. Several seconds, which is a long time in a room like that one. Serena picked up the first page of the access logs. She looked at her own credential on the document. She looked at the date. She looked at the 11-day gap between the moment she had accessed the trust documents and the moment the clause designed to dissolve them had first appeared in the merger draft. She read it the way you read something you already know but have not until now seen written down in a room full of people who are also reading it. She set the page down. Her hands did not shake. They did something more specific than shaking. They went still in the way that hands go still when the person they belong to has stopped deciding what to do with them. She set the page down flat, and her hands remained on top of it and she did not move them for a moment that lasted longer than moments in this kind of room are supposed to last. When she finally looked up, the expression she had been maintaining for the past 30 minutes had not broken. But the cost of it had become visible in a way it had not been before. Something had changed around her eyes. Something in the set of her jaw had gone from controlled to held, which is a different thing. The specific look of a person who has been maintaining a very precise construction and who is now in this room with these documents in front of these people, understanding that the construction is not holding anymore. She had walked into the planning of this merger, having assessed every variable. She had found the trust. She had designed the clause. She had identified Reed as a man whose weakness she could make useful. She had looked at his wife, at Nora, once and concluded that she was not a factor that needed to be accounted for. That had been the error made at the very beginning, before any of the rest of it. The one wrong calculation in a plan that was otherwise meticulous. She was sitting in the conference room where that calculation had been fully laid out in front of everyone who needed to see it. She turned and looked at Nora. It was the first time since Marchetti's that she had looked at her directly, not calculating, not assessing. Something had gone out of the assessment, and what was left was simpler and more final. The look of a person who built something on a foundation that turned out to be wrong, and who can now see the foundation clearly for the first time, and who has nothing left to say about it that would change what is already true. Nora held her gaze for one moment, one full, even moment. Then Serena said quietly, with nothing left to put behind it, "I underestimated you." Nora looked at her for one more second. Then she looked at Diana and said, "I think we have covered what we came to cover." Diana stood. Gerald closed his laptop. Garrett said something about scheduling a follow-up. Diana said her office would be in touch. They left. In the elevator, no one spoke for a moment. Then Gerald looked at the closing doors and said quietly, "Good meeting." "Yes," Nora said. It was. Eleanor Martin Calloway was born on a Thursday evening in the second week of November. The labor was 8 hours, which her doctor described as efficient for a first birth, and Nora filed the word away to tell Eleanor eventually, when she was old enough to find the right things funny, which she already sensed Eleanor would be. Eleanor arrived at 6:47 in the evening. She was small and immediately entirely herself, with the dense specific reality of something that has just entered a world it does not know yet. She had Nora's eyes, not the color but the set of them, the way they took in a room. She had a jaw, the nurse said, looked like her father's, and Nora looked at it and thought, yes, which was all she allowed herself about that for the moment. She had been told that holding her daughter would feel like something she could not prepare for. She had believed this with polite acceptance and private skepticism because she was a person who prepared for things and was good at it. She was wrong. It felt like the specific sensation of understanding all at once why you have been doing a very difficult thing for a very long time, arriving with the full weight of itself after the difficulty is over. Diana had notified Reed through the firm's contact protocol. He arrived at 8:20 and came to the room at 8:30 after Eleanor had been checked and the room had settled into its nighttime quiet. He stood at the doorway first. He looked at the room, at the bassinet beside the bed, and he stood there with an expression she had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man who has walked into a room and been immediately and completely reorganized by what he found in it. "You can come in," she said. He came in. He stood beside the bassinet and looked at his daughter for a long time without speaking. Eleanor was asleep with the total commitment of a newborn recovering from the significant project of arriving in the world. Her small hands were fisted near her face. Reed looked at her with a quality of attention that was unusual for him. He was not evaluating or managing. He was simply looking at her. And she was the only thing in the room. "She is perfect," he said, and the words came out rough in the specific way of a voice asked to carry something heavier than its current condition. "Yes," Nora said. "She is." They were quiet. The room held it without difficulty. After a while, Reed said, still looking at Eleanor, "Will she know what you did? Before any of this, the work, what you built before?" Nora looked at her daughter. "She will know who I am," she said. He looked up. He looked at Nora across the bassinet, and she looked back at him. And there was a moment between them that was not forgiveness and not warmth and not any of the things their marriage had been at its best or worst. It was simpler and more durable than those things. Two people in a room, looking at a fact they both had to reckon with, reckoning with it in the same direction, towards the small sleeping person who had not chosen any of this and who was going to get better than this because they were going to make sure of it. "Okay," he said. He meant it in the full sense. She nodded once. He reached into the bassinet and touched one of Eleanor's small-fisted hands with the tip of one finger, very gently, and Eleanor did not wake. He withdrew his hand with the look of someone who has been granted something they are not certain they have earned yet. He left quietly at 9:15. The room settled back into itself. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, when the apartment had gone quiet and Eleanor had fallen asleep in the crook of her left arm, Nora reached for the portfolio case. She had not opened it since Marchetti's. The legal matters were in other hands now. Serena had received formal notice of charges and retained a criminal defense attorney, which communicated something specific about her understanding of her own exposure. The merger had been dissolved. James Whitfield's structured cooperation framework had preserved 2 of the 3 at-risk client contracts. The third had exited, and the regional office had been restructured rather than closed, the best available outcome which Whitfield had achieved with the competence of a man who had spent 17 years understanding how an institution actually worked. Reed's public statement had run 3 weeks after Marchetti's, specific and unsparing, naming what he had done without framing it as a lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding. She had not written it. She had read it once. She opened the case. The documents were there as always. She moved them aside without reading them. The first time she had done that in 4 months, and the ease of it told her something about where she was now versus where she had been. Beneath them was the envelope. She lifted it out and removed the letter. 1 page, front and back. The dense, slanted handwriting she had known her whole life. She read it slowly, even though she knew every word. She reached the last sentence on the back of the page. "I want you to know that I saw you. I always saw you." She had read that sentence more times than she could count. She had carried it through 4 months of work. The way you carry something essential. Not because you are thinking about it every moment, but because you can feel its weight, and the weight is the right weight, and it keeps you level. She looked at it now. It was still true. It still cost her something to read it. She read it anyway, and then she saw the margin. At the very bottom of the page, fitted carefully below the final line in handwriting slightly smaller than the rest, as if added after the letter was otherwise complete, was something she had not seen in 50 readings. She angled the page toward the lamp. He had written, "I did not leave these things because I thought you would need them. I left them because I wanted something of me to be present in the moment you remembered who you were. I thought I would miss that moment. I see now it does not require my being there." She read it once. She read it again. She held the page toward the lamp for a long time and looked at the shape of the handwriting, the density and slant she had known since she was a child, the handwriting of a man who had watched his daughter her entire life and had trusted all along that she would find her way back to herself when the time came. Who had believed that about her before she believed it about herself? Eleanor shifted in the crook of her arm, the small rolling movement of a sleeping baby redistributing her weight. Nora adjusted her hold without thinking. 6 weeks of practice, and Eleanor settled and did not wake. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, continuous, indifferent, the whole ordinary machinery of a million lives running at their own pace through their own Sunday evenings, entirely unconcerned with what any one person in it was working through. Nora folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She held her daughter and looked at the portfolio case beside her, the worn leather, the brass fittings that had gone from bright to pewter over 30 years of daily use, the initials near the base that you had to know to look for. She had always known to look for them. She reached out with her free hand and set the case gently on the floor beside the couch. Within reach, the way you keep something close that you are not done with yet, but do not need to hold every moment. Eleanor slept on, entirely unconcerned with any of it, which was exactly as it should be. Outside, the city kept going. Inside, Nora held her daughter in the quiet of a Sunday evening and thought about a man who had believed in her long before she had found her way back to believing in herself, and who had made sure, in the only way still available to him, that she would not have to find that way empty-handed. The case had his initials near the base. It would be there in the morning. So would she.